I am Jada. I am 35 years old. At my own graduation party, the one I paid for to celebrate my executive master of business administration, my father raised his crystal glass. He did not look at me. He looked across the table at my younger sister and told a room full of Atlanta elite, "I wish it was you holding that diploma. You are the only child who has ever truly made me proud." My mother actually nodded, sipping her champagne, as if he had just recited poetry. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply stood up and walked out. But what I did next tore their perfect high society world down to the studs. Before I tell you how I dismantled their fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, my family was obsessed with the illusion of Black excellence. My father, Winston, ran a mid-sized logistics company and treated his business title like a royal decree. My mother, Vivian, was the ultimate enabler, a woman who measured human worth by country club memberships and designer labels. And then there was my younger sister, Aaliyah. Aaliyah was the former pageant queen, the undisputed golden child who could do no wrong. She was currently playing the role of wealthy socialite, having married Connor, a commercial real estate executive. Connor was a white man who loved nothing more than playing the wealthy savior to a prominent Black family, always wearing a condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. For my entire life, I was the designated failure. I was the dark cloud in their bright, perfectly curated family portrait. Tonight was supposed to be a turning point. After years of grinding in the shadows, I had finally completed my degree. I wanted to celebrate. More foolishly, I wanted to share that celebration with my family. I rented out the private dining room at one of the most exclusive country clubs in Atlanta. I arranged for a catered 5-course dinner, top-tier champagne, and an open bar for 50 of their closest society friends. I paid for every single dime out of my own pocket. I thought that by inviting them to a venue they revered, hosting an event that matched their impossible standards, they might finally see me as an equal. The evening started with the usual microaggressions. As the guests arrived, Vivian fluttered around the room, greeting the local politicians and business owners. Whenever someone congratulated me on my achievement, she would quickly pivot the conversation to Aaliyah's latest vacation or Connor's recent promotion. I sat at the head of the table in my tailored emerald green dress, gripping my water glass, telling myself to just smile and get through the night. I had spent a decade building my resilience, but the sheer weight of their coordinated indifference still felt suffocating. As the main course was cleared away and the waiters began pouring fresh champagne for the toasts, Winston stood up. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and tapped his silver spoon against his glass. The room fell completely silent. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward the patriarch of the family. I sat up straighter, a foolish spark of hope igniting in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment he would acknowledge my hard work. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Winston began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "We are gathered here to celebrate a milestone. Education is the foundation of our family legacy." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience before landing squarely on my younger sister. Aaliyah sat 2 seats away from me, her hand resting pretentiously on Connor's arm. Winston raised his glass directly toward her. "Aaliyah, my beautiful daughter, watching you navigate your life with such grace and success has been the greatest joy of my life. I look at you and I see the true future of this family. Honestly, I wish it was you holding that diploma tonight. You are the only child who has ever truly made me proud. As for Jada, well, it is a cute attempt to finally catch up at 35. The breath left my lungs. The silence in the private dining room became thick and oppressive. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their velvet chairs, glancing down at their expensive dessert plates. Connor let out a short, arrogant chuckle, shaking his head as he pulled Aaliyah closer to him. Aaliyah beamed, soaking in the praise, not a single ounce of empathy in her eyes for the sister sitting just feet away. Before the awkwardness could fully settle over the room, Vivian chimed in, letting out a light musical laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "Don't be too hard on Jada Winston," she said, waving her manicured hand dismissively in my direction. "It took her a decade to recover from dropping out of Howard. At least she finally finished something, even if she is still just a data entry clerk." Her words were laced with poison, perfectly designed to humiliate me in front of every influential person in the room. They were dragging out a pain I had buried long ago. 10 years ago, the pressure to conform to their impossible standards had broken me. I had suffered a severe mental breakdown during my sophomore year at Howard. Instead of getting me help, Winston and Vivian had called me a weak embarrassment, cut me off financially, and kicked me out. I had to drop out. I was 20 years old, completely alone, and sleeping on a friend's worn-out sofa. They thought I was still that broken girl. Because I kept my life intensely private, they genuinely believed I was just a lowly administrative worker who had scraped together pennies for this dinner. They had no idea who I really was or the kind of power I held. I looked at my father, who was still holding his glass high. I looked at my mother, who was smiling at the society wives as if she had just shared a charming family anecdote. I looked at Connor, who was smirking at me with undisguised pity. I did not argue. I did not try to defend my degree, my career, or my life. Defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you is a waste of breath. I simply reached down, picked up my black leather clutch, and pushed my chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the marble floor, cutting through the murmurs of the guests. I stood up, smoothed the skirt of my dress, and turned my back on the entire room. I began walking toward the heavy mahogany double doors leading out of the private dining room. "Jada, where do you think you are going?" Vivian hissed, her tone dropping its sweet facade. "You do not walk out when your father is giving a speech." I did not stop. My heels clicked steadily against the marble. I was halfway to the exit when Aaliyah's voice rang out, sharp and mocking, cutting through the tense atmosphere of the country club. "Are you running away from the bill again?" "Jada," Aaliyah sneered. "Do not worry, Connor can cover it if you maxed out your little credit cards trying to show off." Let them laugh, I thought to myself. Let them enjoy this final moment of arrogant superiority. Because the reckoning was coming, and I was going to ensure they paid for every single insult with everything they valued most. I did not turn around. I did not break my stride. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of my sister's mocking laughter. The hallway of the country club was quiet, lined with oil paintings of founding members who would have never allowed my father through the front door 30 years ago. Now he sat in their dining room, treating me like the hired help. I walked straight to the mahogany reception desk where the maitre d' stood reviewing the evening reservations. Antoine had been managing this floor for 5 years. He knew the dynamics of every wealthy family in Atlanta. He saw the cold focus in my eyes as I approached. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my card. It was not a standard bank card. It was solid titanium, cold to the touch, and completely black. A Centurion card. The kind of card that requires a personal invitation and a spending history that would make my father's entire logistics company look like a lemonade stand. I placed it softly on the polished wood. "Antoine," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "I need to settle my portion of the bill. Exactly 1 sea bass and 1 sparkling water." Antoine blinked, looking from the titanium card up to my face. "Of course, miss." "And the rest of the private room. Cancel the open bar," I instructed. "Cancel the pre-authorized catering tab. The host of the party inside will be handling the remaining balance for the 50 guests. I believe the total comes to $15,000. Antoine processed the information with the practiced discretion of a high-end hospitality veteran. He swiped my card, handed me a receipt for my single meal, and bowed his head slightly. "Right away, miss." I did not leave immediately. I stood in the glass-walled foyer overlooking the main dining floor, waiting just out of sight. I wanted to see it happen. I had spent a decade taking their insults, swallowing my pride, and playing the role of the damaged outcast. I had earned this view. Through the glass double doors, I watched Antoine approach my father's table. Winston was still standing holding his champagne glass, likely waiting for me to come crawling back in tears. The room was buzzing with quiet conversation. Antoine leaned in respectfully and handed my father the black leather folio containing the itemized bill. The color drained from my father's face so fast he looked physically ill. He stared at the numbers. He looked up at Antoine, then frantically scanned the room for me. The realization hit him. The college dropout, the failure, the data entry clerk was not paying for his extravagant social flex. Vivian leaned over, her pearls clinking against the table. I could read her lips as she asked what was wrong. Winston slammed the folio down. Panic rippled through their perfect posture. 50 of Atlanta's most influential business owners and socialites were sitting at those tables drinking top-shelf liquor that my father suddenly realized he could not afford. Then Connor stood up. My brother-in-law puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his rented tuxedo. He shot a reassuring smile at Aaliyah, playing the role of the wealthy white savior stepping in to rescue his prominent black in-laws. He pulled a silver corporate card from his wallet and tossed it onto the folio with an arrogant flick of his wrist. Antoine picked it up and walked to the terminal. 2 minutes later, he returned. I watched the exact moment Connor's smugness evaporated. Antoine leaned down and whispered politely. Connor's face turned a violent shade of red. He snatched the card, snatched another one from his wallet, and shoved it at the maitre d'. Antoine shook his head, declined again. The whispers started. The society wives sitting at the adjacent tables stopped pretending to ignore the commotion. They leaned in, eyes darting toward Aaliyah, who was suddenly shrinking in her seat. The golden child, the flawless socialite, was sitting at a table her husband could not afford to cover. The facade was cracking in real time. I had seen enough. I turned away from the glass and walked out the front doors into the humid Atlanta night. My chauffeur, Marcus, was already waiting by the curb, holding the door to my Maybach open. I slid into the soft leather interior, the cabin completely silent and insulated from the world outside. Just as Marcus merged onto the highway, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. It was a text message from Connor. You embarrassed your father and humiliated my wife. My commercial real estate firm owns the building your little tech startup rents. Apologize to Aaliyah and reimburse me the $15,000 venue bill by noon tomorrow, or I am terminating your lease. I read the text twice. I did not reply. I simply locked my screen and watched the city lights blur past my window. Connor thought he held the keys to my livelihood. He thought Vanguard Cyber Defense was a struggling little help desk operating out of a closet. He had absolutely no idea what kind of monster he had just threatened. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse overlooking the entire Atlanta skyline. I stood at the kitchen island sipping a double espresso, feeling completely rested. For the first time in 10 years, my mind was entirely clear of family guilt. My phone began to vibrate violently on the marble counter. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. Vivian. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen and bringing the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. Jada, you vindictive little brat! Vivian screamed, her voice shrill and echoing through the speaker. How dare you pull a stunt like that at a country club? Do you have any idea how much damage you did to this family's reputation last night? Your father had to beg a colleague for a short-term loan just to cover the catering staff. I took a slow sip of my espresso. I thought Winston was a highly successful logistics executive. I replied, my voice perfectly calm. Surely $15,000 is pocket change for a man of his stature. Do not play games with me, Vivian snapped. Connor is furious. Aaliyah has been crying all morning because her friends are gossiping about Connor's cards declining. You made a mockery of your sister's husband. You are a disgrace to our social standing. I demand you call Connor right now and beg for his forgiveness. And why exactly would I do that, I asked, leaning against the cool marble counter. Because he is going to evict your pathetic little startup. Vivian spat, her words dripping with venom. He told us he is terminating your lease today. You are going to lose whatever pathetic excuse for a business you have scraped together since you dropped out of Howard. You never could finish anything properly. If you do not fix this right now, I will personally make sure no one in Atlanta's elite circles will ever do business with you. I will ruin you, Jada. The threat hung in the air hollow and entirely detached from reality. Vivian truly believed her country club gossip held power over the corporate empire I had built. She thought she could bully the broke 20-year-old girl she had kicked out a decade ago. Are you finished, Vivian? I asked, my tone dropping to a cold, flat register. Excuse me, she sputtered clearly, caught off guard by my lack of emotion. I asked if you were finished, because I have a very busy morning ahead of me. I ended the call, severing the connection before she could draw another breath. I set my empty espresso cup in the sink and picked up my briefcase. I walked out to my private elevator and rode it down to the ground floor where Marcus was waiting with the car. I settled into the back seat and looked at my reflection in the tinted window. Today was not just another day at the office. Today was the day I dismantled the glass house my family had built. Take me to the corporate headquarters, Marcus, I instructed. It is time to show Connor who actually owns his building. The black Maybach pulled up to the towering glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of downtown Atlanta. Vanguard Cyber Defense occupied the top 10 floors, but our private lobby sat right on the ground level, shielded by tinted security glass and a biometric checkpoint. I stepped out of the car, the morning humidity barely touching my skin, before I was inside the climate-controlled foyer. Connor was pacing in front of the marble reception desk. He was holding a manila folder, tapping it aggressively against the counter. My lead receptionist, a sharp woman named Sarah, remained perfectly composed while Connor raised his voice. I do not care if your boss is in a meeting, Connor sneered, his face flushed. I am a senior vice president at Sterling Commercial Properties. We manage this building. You lease this little IT closet from us. So you will go back there and tell whoever runs this help desk that Connor Hayes is here to deliver an eviction notice. I walked up behind him, my heels clicking sharply against the polished stone. There is no need to harass my staff, Connor, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. He turned around, momentarily startled to see me. He looked me up and down, taking in my tailored designer suit, but his inherent arrogance quickly overrode his confusion. He let out a harsh, condescending laugh. Jada, what a coincidence. I didn't realize you worked the morning shift here. Tell me, do you fix the printers, or do you just answer the phones? I held out my hand. Hand me the notice. He thrust the manila folder into my hand with a victorious smirk. Read it carefully. Your little startup is in violation of its lease agreement. I am terminating the contract effective immediately. You have 30 days to clear out your keyboards and cables. Maybe next time you won't disrespect my wife and your father at a public event. Actions have consequences, Jada. I opened the folder. I scanned the document. It was a standard eviction threat drafted hastily, filled with generic legal jargon. I closed the folder, gripped it with both hands, and tore it straight down the middle. I placed the torn halves neatly on the reception desk. Connor's face contorted with rage. Are you insane? Tearing up the paper doesn't change the reality, you stupid girl. I will call the police right now and have you thrown out of this building for trespassing. I pressed the biometric sensor on the security gates. The heavy glass doors slid open silently. You are not calling anyone, Connor, and I am not trespassing. Follow me. He hesitated, his bravado wavering for a fraction of a second before he stepped through the gates behind me. We stepped into the private executive elevator. I pressed the button for the 40th floor. The ride up was silent. Connor crossed his arms, trying to maintain his posture of authority, but his eyes darted around the luxurious mahogany and brushed steel interior of the elevator. This was not the budget IT closet he expected. The doors glided open to the executive suite. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city. Analysts and executives moved quietly through the corridors. I walked past them straight into my corner office, which was roughly the size of Connor's entire suburban house. I sat down behind my massive custom desk. Connor stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the silver nameplate resting on the edge of the desk. Jada Wilson, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Vanguard Cyber Defense. His jaw dropped. The arrogant sneer melted into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. "This is your company," he stammered, looking around the room. "You own this." "Sit down, Connor," I commanded. He practically fell into the leather chair opposite me. I tapped my keyboard and woke up my primary monitor. I slid a thick leather-bound corporate portfolio across the desk toward him. "I do not just own this company," I said, my voice cold and precise. "I own a holding group called Apex Holdings. 3 weeks ago, Apex quietly acquired a 60% controlling interest in Sterling Commercial Properties. That is your parent company, Connor." He stared at the portfolio, his hands trembling as he opened it. He saw his own company's letterhead, the acquisition signatures, the financial transfers. "You don't own my building," I continued. "I own yours. And as the new majority shareholder, I spent the weekend reviewing the executive performance records. Your portfolio is a disaster." I pulled up a secondary file on my monitor. "You authorized 3 commercial loans for properties in dead zones. You heavily leveraged the firm's assets to secure personal bonuses. You funneled those bonuses directly into maintaining Aaliyah's country club memberships, her designer wardrobe, and the luxury cars you lease to pretend you belong in my family's social circle." Connor's face was completely devoid of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You are grossly incompetent," I stated, leaning forward. "You breached your fiduciary duty to fund a fake lifestyle. I am not just ignoring your ridiculous eviction notice, I am officially terminating your employment. You are fired, Connor. Effective this exact second." The reality of his situation crashed down on him. The arrogant, condescending executive completely shattered. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of my desk, his eyes wide with terror. "Jada, please, you cannot do this. Aaliyah will leave me. She thinks I am getting a $500,000 bonus next month. We are drowning in debt. The credit cards are maxed out. If I lose this job, we lose the house. We lose everything." "That sounds like a personal problem," I replied, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "You wanted to teach me that actions have consequences. Consider the lesson learned." I pressed the silver button on my desk console. "Security, please come to the CEO office and escort a terminated employee off the premises." Connor began to openly weep. The sound was pathetic, a desperate gasping sob. He begged me to reconsider, swearing he would apologize, promising to make Aaliyah apologize. He offered to drop to his knees. I did not blink. 2 towering security guards entered the room, gripped Connor by his arms, and lifted him out of the chair. They marched the sobbing, ruined man out of my office, leaving behind a profound, satisfying silence. I turned back to my monitors, adjusting the quarterly projections, feeling an immense sense of closure. But the peace was short-lived. 10 minutes later, the heavy doors to my office flew open. The security guards were trying to hold her back, but Vivian Wilson pushed past them, her designer handbag swinging wildly. She stormed into the center of the room, her eyes blazing with fury. She had clearly been waiting in the lobby for Connor, likely planning to celebrate my eviction over brunch. Instead, she had watched her precious son-in-law get dragged out of the building in tears. "It's fine, let her in," I told the guards, waving them away. The doors shut, leaving me alone with my mother. Vivian stopped and looked around the massive executive suite. I could see her calculating the wealth in the room. The custom artwork, the imported furniture, the sheer scale of the operation. She realized instantly that I was not the struggling failure they had painted me to be. A normal mother would have felt pride or perhaps shame for how she had treated me. Vivian only felt opportunity. She regained her perfect high society composure, smoothing her silk blouse and lifting her chin. She did not apologize for last night. She did not ask how I built this empire. She walked right up to my desk and slammed her hands down on the polished wood. "You will reinstate Connor immediately," Vivian demanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. "You will restore his salary, and you will double his bonus. You owe this family your success, Jada. Without us pushing you, you would be nothing." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the woman who gave birth to me. "I owe you absolutely nothing. Connor is a liability, and he is fired. Now get out of my office before I have you thrown out the exact same way he was. Vivian smiled. It was a chilling, predatory smile. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. You think you hold all the cards because you sit in a fancy chair? You listen to me very carefully. You reinstate Connor right now, or I will stop paying the monthly minimums on the $200,000 business loans you took out 5 years ago. The room seemed to lose all its air. I stared at her, my mind racing. I never took out any loans. Vivian's smile widened into a triumphant smirk. Oh, but your social security number did. 5 years ago, when Aaliyah was planning her beautiful destination wedding, your father and I needed extra capital. We knew you were not using your credit. You were just a depressed college dropout waiting tables. So we used your old college financial aid records. We secured the loans in your name. We have been paying the minimums to keep the accounts quiet. My blood ran ice cold. The sheer audacity, the criminal magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. They stole my identity. They used my name to fund the golden child's extravagant wedding while I was struggling to pay for groceries. Let's see how your prestigious corporate board reacts when their brilliant CEO is hit with a massive personal bankruptcy suit, Vivian taunted, stepping back and crossing her arms. Let's see how your clients feel about trusting their cyber defense to a woman who cannot even manage her own debts. You are going to give Connor his job back, and you are going to pay off those loans yourself. Because if you do not, I will burn your precious company to the ground. She stood there supremely confident, waiting for me to break. She expected the 20-year-old girl who used to cry for her affection to surrender. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The 40-story glass monolith of the Sterling Commercial Tower pierced the Atlanta skyline like a jagged crystal. I owned the top 3 floors, a sprawling expanse of brushed steel, smart glass, and silent efficiency that served as the nervous system for Vanguard cyber defense. As Marcus pulled the Maybach into the private underground executive bay, I felt my pulse steady into a slow, rhythmic beat. I stepped into the dedicated biometric elevator and pressed my thumb against the scanner. The doors sealed shut, launching me upward in absolute silence. I had spent the entire ride from my penthouse visualizing this exact encounter, turning over every possible variable. I knew Connor. I knew his blinding arrogance, his fragile ego, and his desperate need to assert dominance over anyone he deemed beneath him. He was a man who had coasted through life on unearned confidence, and his family name completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath his feet was already crumbling. The elevator chimed a soft melodic note as it reached the 40th floor. The doors slid open to reveal my sanctuary. The Vanguard lobby was a testament to modern power. Italian black marble floors stretched out like a dark mirror reflecting the soft, recessed lighting above. The air smelled faintly of cedar and clean ozone. Behind a massive curved reception desk, carved from a single piece of slate, sat my lead security coordinator, David. He gave me a sharp nod as I walked past, my heels clicking a steady, commanding rhythm against the stone. I headed straight for my corner office, a panoramic glass suite that overlooked the sprawling city below. I barely had time to sit behind my desk and power on my primary monitors before the absolute tranquility of my floor was shattered. The sound of a raised, distinctly entitled voice echoed down the corridor. It was loud, nasal, and dripping with unearned authority. It was a voice used to interrupting a voice that assumed the world was its personal audience. I need to see the person in charge of this floor right now. I am not waiting. I leaned back in my leather chair, interlacing my fingers. I watched through the frosted smart glass of my office walls as the silhouette of a man barged past the secondary security checkpoint. He was moving fast, his arms swinging aggressively. My office door was open, just a crack, allowing his voice to carry perfectly. "Sir, you cannot proceed past this point without a scheduled appointment," David said, his tone dangerously calm and professional. "I do not need an appointment to walk through a building my firm manages," Connor snapped loudly, stopping just outside my office suite. Do you have any idea who I am? I am Connor Hayes. I am a senior vice president at Sterling Commercial Properties. We own this tower. Your little startup leases this space from us. So you will go back to your desk, pick up your phone, and tell whoever runs this cute little IT help desk that I am here to deliver a formal eviction notice. And I want them out here right now. I stood up slowly, smoothing the sharp lines of my tailored emerald suit. I walked to my office door and pulled it open, stepping out into the corridor. Connor stood there, his face flushed red with exertion and unearned importance. He was wearing a navy blue suit that looked slightly too tight across the shoulders, a fresh bead of sweat forming at his hairline. In his right hand, he gripped a manila folder so tightly his knuckles were turning white. He turned to look at me, his eyes sweeping over my outfit, stopping for a fraction of a second on my face. For a moment, he actually looked confused. He had expected to find me crying in my apartment begging my mother for a loan to cover his country club tab. Seeing me standing in the middle of a high-security corporate headquarters clearly short-circuited his brain. But true to form, his immense privilege quickly overrode his confusion. His lips curled into a nasty, familiar smirk. "Jada," he said, letting out a short, condescending laugh. "What a surprise. I did not realize you worked the morning shift here. Tell me, do you fix the printers, or do you just answer the phones?" "Actually, it makes perfect sense. Your mother said you were doing data entry for some struggling tech outfit." I said nothing. I just stared at him, letting his words hang in the sterile, quiet air of my corridor. My silence clearly agitated him, but he puffed out his chest, stepping closer to invade my personal space. "Well, since you are already here, you can make yourself useful." Connor continued, waving the manila folder in my face. "Take this to whoever your boss is. This is a formal termination of lease. Your little startup is in violation of its commercial contract. I am shutting this place down effective immediately. You and your co-workers have exactly 30 days to pack up your keyboards and your Ethernet cables and get out of my building." He thrust the folder toward my chest. I did not flinch. I slowly raised my hand and took the folder from his grasp. I opened it. It was a standard commercial eviction threat drafted hastily and filled with generic legal jargon, citing ambiguous breaches of property conduct. It was a document born out of pure spite, a desperate attempt by a weak man to punish a black woman who had dared to publicly humiliate his wife. "Maybe next time you will not disrespect my wife and your father at a public event," Connor said, crossing his arms and leaning back on his heels, clearly immensely satisfied with himself. "Actions have consequences, Jada. You thought you could embarrass us and just walk away. You thought you were so clever canceling that check. But you forgot who you were dealing with. Aaliyah was crying all morning because of you. My corporate card was declined in front of the mayor because of you. So now you get to explain to your boss why your entire company is being thrown out onto the street." I looked down at the eviction notice, reading the final paragraph detailing the 30-day vacate order. I took a slow, deep breath, the scent of expensive cedar filling my lungs. I looked back up at Connor. His blue eyes were wide, waiting for the panic, waiting for the tears, waiting for me to beg. I gripped the top edge of the eviction notice with my right hand and the bottom edge with my left. I pulled my hands in opposite directions. The heavy cardstock ripped down the center with a loud, satisfying tear. Connor flinched, his arms dropping to his sides. I placed the two halves together, gripped them again, and ripped them across the middle. I let the 4 torn pieces of his empty threat fall from my fingers. They fluttered through the air, landing silently on the pristine black marble floor between us. Connor stared at the pieces of paper, then looked up at me, his face contorting into an ugly mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The smirk was completely gone, replaced by the furious realization that I was not playing his game. "Are you completely insane?" he yelled, his voice cracking, slightly echoing off the glass walls. "Tearing up the paper does not change the reality, you stupid girl. You do not own this space. You do not own anything. I am the landlord. You are a tenant. I will call the Atlanta Police Department right now. I will have you physically thrown out of this building for trespassing and vandalism. I will make sure you are locked up before noon." He reached into his jacket pocket, fumbling for his phone, his hands shaking with anger. I did not move a muscle. I simply turned my head slightly toward the open door of my office. I walked back to my desk, keeping my eyes locked on his furious red face. I reached out and pressed the silver intercom button on my console. "Actually, Connor," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that carried effortlessly across the room. "I am the one calling security." The silence in my office was absolute, save for the faint hum of Atlanta traffic 40 floors below. Connor stood frozen in the corridor, staring at me with a muscle feathering in his jaw. He let out a sharp, breathless laugh, looking around the expansive suite, as if expecting a hidden camera crew to emerge from behind the frosted smart glass. He still thought this was a game, a desperate bluff from a woman he had spent a decade dismissing. "You are calling security," he scoffed, puffing his chest back out, trying to regain his shattered momentum. "On me, in a building my firm owns, Jada, you have completely lost your mind. I'm going to have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs." I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I simply turned on my heel and walked back to my desk. I reached into the top drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The embossed gold lettering on the cover caught the morning light. I placed my hand flat on the cool leather and slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany surface. It glided effortlessly, stopping exactly inches from the edge of the desk, right where he would have to step forward to see it. "Open it," I commanded. He hesitated. His eyes darted from the portfolio to my face, searching for a weakness, a crack in my composure. Finding none, the sheer authority in my tone compelled his hands to move. He stepped into my office, reached out, and flipped open the heavy cover. "You keep calling my company a cute little IT help desk," I said, leaning back in my high-backed chair and steepling my fingers. "Vanguard Cyber Defense is currently the primary security contractor for 3 multinational banks, 2 federal government agencies, and half the logistics firms on the eastern seaboard. But that is just my day job. My real wealth sits in a holding company, Apex Holdings." Connor's eyes scanned the first page. I watched his pupils dart back and forth, tracking the dense legal jargon, the bolded signatures, the undeniable financial transfers. The arrogant flushed red of his cheeks rapidly drained away, leaving a sickly ashen gray in its wake. "3 weeks ago," I continued, my voice sharp and precise, cutting through the silence of the room like a scalpel. "Apex Holdings quietly acquired a 60% controlling interest in Sterling Commercial Properties. That is your parent real estate firm, Connor. I do not lease this space from you. I own the concrete beneath your feet. I own the steel holding up this roof. And as of this morning, I own your employment contract." He flipped to the next page, his hands beginning to visibly tremble. The thick paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. He was staring directly at his own firm's letterhead, permanently stamped with the Apex Holdings watermark of acquisition. "This cannot be real," he whispered, sounding as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of his lungs. "Sterling is a legacy firm. They would never sell to outside capital without a board vote." "They sold to a holding company because they were bleeding capital," I corrected him, standing up to assert my full presence in the room. "And they were bleeding capital because of bloated executive salaries and catastrophic property management. My acquisition team swallowed your firm whole while you were busy taking my sister to wine tastings, but owning your company was just the beginning." I walked around the desk, closing the physical distance between us. As the new majority shareholder, I spent my entire weekend conducting a forensic audit of the executive performance records. Your portfolio in particular was a fascinating read. I reached over and tapped a single key on my console. The massive screen mounted behind my desk flickered to life, illuminating the room with rows of glaring red numbers, highlighted transaction logs, and internal banking communications. "You authorized 3 massive commercial loans for retail spaces in complete dead zones," I stated, reading off the data he already knew was true. "Properties that have sat completely vacant for over 2 years. You heavily leveraged the firm's core assets to secure those toxic loans, and then you manipulated the short-term revenue projections to trigger your own executive bonus structure." Connor swallowed hard. Sweat was now visibly beading on his forehead, rolling down his temples. He gripped the edge of the portfolio, his knuckles stark white. "Those were long-term investments," he stammered, his voice lacking any of its former volume or arrogance. "The market will rebound. I was projecting future neighborhood growth. You were committing gross incompetence and borderline corporate fraud. I said, my tone as cold as ice. You funneled those massive unearned bonuses directly into your personal accounts. I tracked the spending, Connor. It was not hard. You used company leverage to maintain Aaliyah's $60,000 country club membership. You used it to pay the leases on those matching luxury SUVs you both drive. You used it to buy her designer wardrobe, the 5-course dinners, the expensive champagne, just so the two of you could pretend you actually belonged in Atlanta's elite circles. I did what I had to do to provide for my family. He pleaded, the polished executive facade completely shattering into pieces. Aaliyah expects a certain lifestyle. Your father expects me to be a certain kind of provider. You know how they are, Jada. You provided a mirage, I said, devoid of a single ounce of sympathy. You breached your fiduciary duty to fund a fake lifestyle. You endangered an entire commercial real estate firm just so you could walk into a private dining room and throw down a corporate card you did not actually own. I stood directly in front of him now. So let me be very clear about what is happening here. You are not evicting me. I am taking immediate disciplinary action against you. For gross incompetence, deliberate financial manipulation, and severe breach of fiduciary duty, you are officially terminated, Connor. I am firing you, effective this exact second. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a freight train. The man who had strutted past my security team 10 minutes ago, loudly mocking my business and threatening my livelihood, was entirely gone. In his place stood a ruined, desperate imposter. Connor dropped the condescending tone. He dropped the portfolio onto my desk. His hands shook violently as he reached out, clutching the air between us, as if trying to grab onto a lifeline that did not exist. You can't do this. Aaliyah will leave me if I lose my bonus. We're drowning in debt from her country club dues. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the faint hum of the climate control system. I looked at the woman standing across from me, her posture rigid with practiced superiority. Vivian genuinely believed she had just delivered a checkmate. In her world, the threat of social ruin and financial scandal was the ultimate weapon. She expected me to crumble, to revert to the fragile 20-year-old girl who used to beg for her scraps of affection. She expected tears. She expected surrender. Instead, I felt a slow, dark smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of defeat. It was the smile of a predator realizing its prey had just willingly walked into a steel trap. Identity theft, I said, letting the words roll off my tongue, slowly testing their weight in the massive executive suite. You and Winston committed federal identity theft and bank fraud to pay for Aaliyah's wedding. Oh, stop being so dramatic. Jada, Vivian scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively. She paced toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the Atlanta traffic as if she owned it. It is not theft when it is family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head for 2 decades. We invested in you. You owed us a return on that investment, especially after you embarrassed us by dropping out of Howard. Aaliyah needed that wedding. She was marrying into the Hayes family. We had appearances to maintain, and your father's company was going through a brief liquidity issue. It was a temporary bridge. A $200,000 bridge? I clarified, my voice dangerously soft. Taken out in the name of a college dropout without her consent, forged signatures, fraudulent financial disclosures. A bridge we have been maintaining? Vivian snapped, turning back to glare at me. We have never missed a minimum payment. Your credit score is actually fantastic right now, thanks to us. You should be thanking me. But that stops today. If you do not pick up that phone call downstairs and tell your security thugs to bring Connor back up here with a full apology and a doubled bonus, I will stop the transfers. The banks will come looking for you. The media will find out that the brilliant CEO of Vanguard Cyber Defense is defaulting on hundreds of thousands in personal debt. Your board of directors will demand your resignation before Friday. I needed her to keep talking. I needed every single detail she was arrogant enough to volunteer. I rested my elbows on the desk and steepled my fingers, projecting the exact image of a cornered executive trying to negotiate. Which banks, Vivian? I asked, injecting just enough manufactured panic into my voice to feed her ego. If I'm going to fix this, I need to know exactly what I am dealing with. How did you even bypass the identity verification protocols? Vivian's chest puffed out slightly. She loved being the smartest person in the room. She loved explaining her victories. We used the old financial aid documents you left in your bedroom desk when you moved out, she boasted, stepping back to the center of the room. You were always so careless with your paperwork. We had your social security number, your birth certificate, and your previous address histories. Winston's friend at First Georgia Fidelity pushed the primary loan through without requiring an in-person verification. We opened a secondary line of credit through Apex Financial. I nearly laughed out loud. Apex Financial. She had no idea that Apex Holdings, the parent company I controlled, owned a majority stake in that specific regional bank. She had literally defrauded a bank that I currently owned. And the funds I pressed, keeping my face a mask of terrified submission. They were transferred directly to Aaliyah's wedding vendors. Don't be dense. Vivian rolled her eyes. We transferred the funds into a joint checking account under your name and your father's name. We used it to pay the event planners, the florist, the caterers, and the down payment on Aaliyah and Connor's first house. It was an investment in the family's future, an investment you are going to protect today. I reached under my desk and pressed a sequence of keys on my hidden security console. A small green light blinked on my primary monitor, confirming that the high-definition audio and video recording system integrated into my office architecture had captured every single word of her confession. I let the facade drop. The manufactured panic melted away, replaced by the cold, calculating CEO who had built a cyber intelligence empire from the ground up. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany. Let me explain exactly what is going to happen now, Vivian. I said, my voice dropping back to that icy flat register that always made my competitors sweat. I am not calling security to bring Connor back. Connor is gone. He is currently standing on the pavement outside, holding a cardboard box, wondering how he is going to explain to his country club wife that he just lost his career because he tried to bully the wrong woman. Vivian's smug expression faltered. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised a hand, silencing her with a look so severe she actually took a step back. Secondly, I continued, you are going to leave this building immediately. You are going to go back to your pristine suburban mansion, and you are going to tell Winston that your little extortion plan failed. You are going to tell him that you just sat in my office completely unprompted and confessed to multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. I confessed to nothing, Vivian shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red. It is my word against yours. No one will believe a bitter, estranged daughter over a prominent Atlanta socialite. I tapped my fingernail against the edge of my monitor. My company secures the digital infrastructure for the federal government, Vivian. Did you honestly think I would not have a military-grade surveillance system active in my own executive suite? I have your entire confession recorded in flawless audio clarity. The blood drained from her face so fast I thought she might actually faint. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest. You wouldn't, she whispered, the reality of her colossal miscalculation finally penetrating her arrogance. I am your mother. You would not send your own parents to prison. You stopped being my mother the night you watched me break down from exhaustion and threw me out onto the street with nothing. I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. You traded your maternal rights for country club prestige a long time ago. Now you are just a criminal who stole my identity. I stood up to my full height, projecting absolute dominance over the room. You threatened my company. You threatened my board. You threatened the empire I bled to build. Now I am going to dismantle yours. Jada, please. Vivian stammered, the venom completely gone, replaced by naked terror. We can fix this. We can pay the loans off quietly. You don't need to involve the authorities. Winston's heart cannot take a scandal like this. It will kill him. Winston's heart is not my concern, I said coldly. You have exactly 24 hours to liquidate whatever assets you need to pay off that $200,000 debt in full. I want those accounts closed with a zero balance by noon tomorrow. If I receive so much as a single notification of a missed payment, or an outstanding balance, I am sending this recording directly to the FBI Fraud Division and the Atlanta Business Press. I press the intercom button on my desk. David, please send 2 guards up to my suite. My mother is leaving and she requires an escort to ensure she finds the exit. Vivian stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. The illusion of her superiority was entirely broken. She was looking at a woman she did not recognize, a woman possessing a magnitude of power she could not comprehend. "You are a monster," she whispered, her voice shaking. "No, Vivian," I replied, sitting back down and turning my attention to my monitors. "I am just the return on your investment." The security guards entered the room, moving with silent efficiency. They flanked Vivian, gesturing politely but firmly toward the open doors. She did not argue. She did not scream. She turned and walked out of the office, her shoulders slumped, her entire world collapsing around her. I watched the heavy doors swing shut, sealing the executive suite in total silence once again. The eviction threat was neutralized. The extortion attempt was crushed. But the war was far from over. My parents had stolen my name and they were going to pay for it with everything they valued most. I picked up my encrypted mobile phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney. It was time to initiate the next phase of the protocol. I stared at my mother in dead silence. The ambient hum of the climate control system on the 40th floor suddenly felt magnified in the sprawling quiet of my office. $200,000. The number echoed against the glass walls. I had never signed for a single business loan in my entire life. Every proprietary algorithm, every encrypted server rack, every payroll check for Vanguard Cyber Defense had been funded by the grueling freelance coding contracts I scraped together during my first 3 years sleeping on a second-hand futon. I had bootstrapped my empire with sweat, caffeine, and absolute paranoia. I owed the banks nothing. Vivian misread my silence for terrified submission. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag, the victory already settling into her rigid posture. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the Atlanta traffic as if she personally owned the pavement. "It is a very simple arrangement, Jada," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You fix Connor's employment situation today, and we continue managing the debt. Everyone wins, and the family remains intact." "You open lines of credit in my name," I said, keeping my tone dangerously flat. I needed her to keep talking. I needed her narcissism to override her basic survival instincts. "How exactly did you manage that, Vivian?" The bank identity verification protocols 5 years ago were already incredibly stringent. "Oh, please," Vivian scoffed, turning back to face me. "You always were so careless with your personal paperwork. When Winston and I finally kicked you out of the house after your little breakdown at Howard, you left your entire desk drawer full of financial aid forms. Your social security card, your birth certificate, your previous tax returns from those high school summer jobs you insisted on working. It was all just sitting there waiting to be utilized." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool, polished mahogany of my desk. I projected the exact image of a cornered executive trying to negotiate her way out of a crisis. "And the banks just handed you the money. $200,000 is a massive unsecured liability. Winston has friends at First Georgia Fidelity," she said, waving her hand as if dismissing a minor technicality. "A few digital signatures, an online application linking to your pristine credit history at the time, and the funds were approved within 48 hours. We set up a dedicated checking account to receive the deposits. It was brilliant, really. To pay for what I asked, sharpening the edge in my voice to feign outrage. My medical bills when I was hospitalized. My tuition before you cut me off completely." Vivian let out a short, harsh laugh that bounced off the imported artwork on my walls. "Do not flatter yourself, Jada. You had already proven you were a lost cause. No, we needed the capital for something that actually mattered to this family's future." She paused, her eyes gleaming with toxic pride. Aaliyah's wedding. The puzzle pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. Aaliyah and Connor's extravagant destination wedding in Santorini. I remembered the social media posts, the private chartered flights for the bridal party, the imported Italian floral arrangements, the five-course Michelin-starred catering on a cliffside overlooking the Aegean Sea. I had seen the photos splashed across the society pages of Atlanta's most exclusive magazines. Winston had boasted to the press about paying for the entire $250,000 affair straight out of his own pocket. "You used my stolen identity to fund my sister's wedding," I stated. The sheer sociopathy of the act was staggering. They had actively sabotaged the financial future of their discarded daughter just to throw an opulent party for their golden child. "We made an investment in the family brand," Vivian corrected, her tone hardening into defensive anger. "Aaliyah was marrying into the Hayes family. Connor was a rising executive. We could not exactly host a backyard barbecue like commoners." Winston's logistics company was facing a temporary cash flow issue that quarter due to some bad supply chain contracts. "We needed a bridge loan, and your unused credit was the perfect vehicle. You owed us for the 2 decades we spent feeding and housing you." I stood up slowly, planting my hands flat on my desk. "You committed federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. You forged my signature on legally binding financial documents." "It is only fraud if someone reports it," Vivian said, completely unbothered by the criminal reality of her actions. "And you are not going to report anything. If you try to blow the whistle, we will simply stop paying the monthly minimums. The default will trigger an immediate cascade effect on your personal credit. It will breach the moral turpitude and financial stability clauses I am absolutely sure your corporate board requires for a chief executive. You will lose everything you have built in this ridiculous glass tower." "I could go to the police right now," I challenged her, watching her face closely, looking for any sign of hesitation. Vivian smiled triumphantly. She closed the distance between us, walking right up to the edge of my desk. Her eyes were cold, merciless, and devoid of any maternal instinct. "You're a dropout, Jada," she whispered, her voice laced with absolute poison. "Who is a judge going to believe, a pillar of the community like your father or you? Winston plays golf with the district attorney. He donates thousands to the police benevolence fund. You are just the unstable middle child with a documented history of mental breakdowns who got lucky with a tech startup. They will think you took out the loans yourself to fund this very company and are now trying to frame your loving parents to avoid paying it back." She leaned closer, the cloying scent of her expensive perfume filling the sterilized air of my office. "You have until noon to reinstate Connor. If I do not get a phone call from him confirming his bonus has been doubled, I am defaulting on the accounts. Make your choice, Jada." I did not yield. I stared at my mother in dead silence. The ambient hum of the climate-controlled air system on the 40th floor suddenly felt magnified in the sprawling quiet of my office. $200,000. The number echoed against the glass walls. I had never signed for a single business loan in my entire life. Every proprietary algorithm, every encrypted server rack, every payroll check for Vanguard cyber defense had been funded by the grueling freelance coding contracts I scraped together during my first 3 years sleeping on a secondhand futon. I had bootstrapped my empire with sweat, caffeine, and absolute paranoia. I owed the banks nothing. Vivian misread my silence for terrified submission. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag, the victory already settling into her rigid posture. She thought her leverage was absolute. I reached out and pressed the silver button on my console. "David," I said, my voice entirely devoid of panic. "Cancel the security escort. Send Marcus Vance into my office immediately." Vivian frowned, her manicured brow furrowing. "Who is Marcus Vance?" she demanded, her tone sharpening. "I told you to reinstate Connor. If you think you can stall me by bringing in some human resources manager, you are sorely mistaken." "Marcus Vance is not human resources, Vivian," I replied smoothly. "He is my chief legal counsel. Before I brought him on board to protect Vanguard, he spent 15 years as a ruthless federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice, specializing in white-collar crime, corporate embezzlement, and wire fraud." The heavy glass doors slid open and Marcus walked into the room. He was a towering, impeccably dressed man who moved with the silent, predatory grace of a shark. He held a sleek digital tablet in his right hand. He did not introduce himself to my mother. He simply stood beside my desk, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto Vivian, assessing her not as a guest but as a hostile target. "Marcus," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on my mother. "My parents, Winston and Vivian Wilson, have committed federal identity theft and bank fraud. They utilized my outdated college Social Security records, the financial aid documents I left in my desk, before my breakdown to secure over $200,000 in commercial loans. They forged my signature and bypassed verification protocols through a corrupt contact at First Georgia Fidelity. They used my stolen identity to fund Aaliyah's extravagant $250,000 destination wedding." Vivian tried to speak, but the sheer bluntness of my disclosure paralyzed her vocal cords. She looked from me to the massive former federal prosecutor, the reality of her colossal miscalculation finally penetrating her arrogance. I tapped my keyboard and transferred the encrypted audio file from my security system directly to Marcus's tablet. His screen lit up with the waveform of the recording. "Georgia is a one-party consent state," I stated, leaning back in my high-backed leather chair. "That is a high-definition audio recording of the conversation that just took place in this room. You will hear a full, uncoerced confession from Vivian detailing exactly how she and Winston committed the fraud, including her direct attempt to extort a corporate chief executive." Marcus tapped the screen of his tablet, his eyes scanning the data. "I want charges filed immediately, Marcus." I instructed, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "I want federal warrants drafted. Do whatever is necessary to freeze their personal accounts and bring the full weight of the law down on their estate." "Understood." Jada, Marcus said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded immediate fear. He turned his attention fully to Vivian. "Mrs. Wilson, you have just confessed to violations of United States Code, Title 18, Section 1344 for bank fraud and Section 1028 for aggravated identity theft. Each count carries a maximum penalty of 30 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $1 million. Vivian stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest as if she had been physically struck. "You wouldn't," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "I am your mother. You would not send your own parents to prison over a wedding loan. It gets worse." "Mrs. Wilson." Marcus continued, stepping forward, using his height to completely dominate the physical space in the room. "Because you used those defrauded funds to pay for the down payment on Connor and Aaliyah's new house, that property is now subject to federal asset forfeiture. The moment I file these charges, the Department of Justice will seize their home. Your golden child and her husband will be evicted by federal marshals. You did not just ruin your own life today, you ruined theirs." Vivian's perfectly manicured composure shattered like cheap glass dropped on concrete. The elegant, untouchable mask of the Atlanta socialite completely dissolved, revealing the desperate, feral cruelty underneath. Her eyes bulged and the veins in her neck strained against her pearl necklace. She lunged forward, slamming her hands onto my desk, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure hatred. "You selfish, ugly outcast!" She screamed, her voice shrill and entirely unhinged, tearing through the sophisticated quiet of the executive suite. "How dare you do this to us? How dare you threaten this family? You should be down on your knees thanking us for giving you a life. You were a complete failure, a depressed dropout taking up space in my home, a dark cloud hanging over everything we tried to build." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the venom without blinking. The words should have hurt, but they did not. They were the final liberating confirmation that my family was truly dead to me. "Aaliyah needed that money," Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking as spit flew from her lips. "She deserved a flawless wedding. She married a man of substance. She is a pillar of society. What were you going to do with that credit? Nothing. You were a broken, useless girl waiting tables. We used your credit for a daughter who actually matters. You should be grateful your pathetic existence finally served a purpose for someone who is actually worth something." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had spent 35 years actively trying to destroy my self-worth. I felt no anger, I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but cold, absolute clarity. You are right about one thing, Vivian, I said softly. I was broken, but I rebuilt myself into titanium. And you just broke your own teeth trying to bite me. I looked up at Marcus. We are done here. Call the authorities. Vivian let out a guttural scream, swiping her arm across my desk in a blind rage, sending a crystal paperweight shattering against the far wall. Marcus moved with terrifying speed, gripping her by the upper arm and effortlessly subduing her. He hauled her toward the heavy glass doors as she kicked and thrashed, cursing my name, promising to ruin me, promising that Winston would destroy my company. I turned my chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I listened to her screams fade down the hallway as the elevator doors sealed her fate. The extortion was over. The truth was out. But the fallout was just beginning, and I was going to ensure that every single person who enabled their fake empire felt the shockwave. Vivian fought the security guards with the feral desperation of a woman watching her entire universe collapse. Her expensive stiletto heels scuffed harshly against the pristine Italian marble of my office floor. She thrashed against the firm grip of the two men, her perfectly coiffed hair falling into her face, her designer handbag slipping from her shoulder to spill a gold compact and a leather wallet across the ground. She did not care about the mess. The elegant, untouchable facade of the Atlanta socialite was completely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered rage. "You ungrateful wretch!" she screamed, her voice cracking as they dragged her backward toward the corridor. "We made you. We gave you everything. Winston will destroy you for this. You will have nothing left but this glass cage." I did not blink. I stood behind my desk, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the polished mahogany. I watched her with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. I felt absolutely no guilt. The woman being hauled out of my executive suite was not a mother. She was a parasite who had finally been severed from her host. The heavy soundproof glass doors of the suite slid shut. The acoustic dampening technology of the 40th floor engaged instantly. The shrill echoes of Vivian's threats were cut off mid-sentence, leaving the room blanketed in a sudden, profound quiet. The silence in my office was deafening. It was heavy, sterile, and absolutely satisfying. Marcus Vance stood near the center of the room, smoothing the lapels of his custom charcoal suit. He had not broken a sweat. The former federal prosecutor possessed a terrifying calm, a predator entirely at home in the aftermath of a kill. "Fascinating family dynamic," Marcus observed dryly, stepping over Vivian's discarded lipstick tube. "Shall I have maintenance send someone up for the trash?" "Leave it for the night crew," I replied, sinking back into my high-backed leather chair. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a sharp, crystalline focus. "We have a narrow window before Winston realizes his wife just handed us the rope to hang them both. I want the injunctions filed immediately. I want the wire fraud and identity theft charges submitted to the Department of Justice before her car leaves the underground parking garage. Freeze their personal accounts. Lock down the deed to Connor and Aaliyah's house." "Already in motion," Marcus said. He walked over to the secondary workstation situated along the glass wall, pulling a sleek digital tablet from his inner jacket pocket. He synced his device to my primary network. The massive monitor mounted behind my desk flickered, replacing the Vanguard Cyber Defense logo with a dense, cascading wall of financial data, legal filings, and banking ledgers. "We have the audio confession," Marcus continued, his fingers flying across the digital keyboard with practiced precision. "We have the fraudulent loan applications from First Georgia Fidelity and Apex Financial. We have the routing numbers proving the funds were directly transferred to the wedding vendors and the real estate escrow account. The bank fraud case is airtight, but if we are going to drop the federal hammer on Winston, we need to dismantle the underlying motive." He brought up a secondary window displaying the corporate registry and public tax filings for Winston's business, Zenith Freight and Logistics. "Your mother claimed they needed your stolen identity as a bridge loan because Zenith was facing a temporary liquidity crisis." Marcus stated, his eyes scanning the dense columns of numbers. "A $200,000 bridge for a company that handles regional supply chain contracts. Let us see just how badly Winston was bleeding capital. I turned my chair to face the screen, my eyes tracking the data. As the CEO of a cyber intelligence firm, analyzing digital footprints and forensic accounting was second nature to me. But as I looked at the gross revenue charts for Zenith Freight, a cold sense of confusion began to creep in. The math is wrong, I said, leaning forward and pointing at the screen. Look at their Q3 and Q4 earnings from 5 years ago, exactly when they took out the fraudulent loans in my name. Zenith reported $42 million in gross revenue that year. Operating costs were standard, payroll was stable, there was no liquidity crisis. Marcus frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. He tapped the screen, pulling up the Schedule C filings and the accounts payable ledgers. You are right. A company moving $40 million a year does not resort to federal identity theft to cover a $200,000 wedding expense. They could have easily secured a legitimate corporate line of credit. Winston had the collateral. Why risk 30 years in federal prison for pocket change? Unless the $40 million was an illusion, I suggested, the analytical part of my brain taking over. Dig into their vendor payouts. Look at the outgoing cash flow. Marcus executed a rapid search query cross-referencing Zenith's outgoing wire transfers against registered corporate entities. The screen blurred as thousands of transactions were processed. Then the data stopped scrolling. A list of 30 different limited liability companies populated the monitor. Look at this, Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, the predatory hum returning to his tone. Winston was bleeding capital, but not because of bad supply chain contracts. He was bleeding it on purpose. He highlighted a block of transactions. Over the span of 3 years, Zenith Freight had paid out millions of dollars to these 30 specific LLCs. The invoices were listed under vague, unquantifiable services: freight consulting, route optimization analysis, strategic supply chain management. These are ghost vendors, Marcus stated, tracing a line of data on the screen with his index finger. Shell corporations. Look at the routing numbers. The money leaves Zenith, bounces through a series of domestic holding companies in Delaware and Nevada, and then vanishes. They are dummy accounts designed to look like legitimate operational losses. It is a layering scheme, I realized, a cold chill running down my spine. Winston is laundering money. He is deliberately tanking his own company's profit margins to wash millions of dollars through these shell entities. But why Zenith is a legitimate logistics firm? He is not running a cartel. Where is the dirty money coming from in the first place? Marcus did not answer immediately. He was typing furiously now, running a reverse trace on the originating accounts that were feeding capital into Zenith Freight before it was washed back out. The server hummed audibly as it cracked through layers of corporate obfuscation. Suddenly, the screen flashed red. A single heavily encrypted trust account appeared at the top of the monitor. The origin point. Marcus froze. He stopped typing. The absolute stillness of his massive frame sent a warning signal directly to my nervous system. He slowly lowered his hands from the keyboard and turned to face me. The look in his eyes was one of pure, unfiltered shock. Jada, my lawyer said, turning the monitor toward me so I could clearly read the name listed on the origin account. Your father's company isn't just failing. Look at these shell transfers. They've been laundering money out of your late grandmother's estate trust. I stared at the glowing pixels on Marcus's tablet, the name of the account burning into my retinas. The Eleanor Hayes Generational Trust, my grandmother's estate. The air in my office suddenly felt incredibly heavy, thick with a betrayal so profound it temporarily paralyzed my lungs. My grandmother had been the only person in that house who ever looked at me with genuine pride, the only one who encouraged my early interest in coding and mathematics. When she died 7 years ago, Winston told us her prolonged medical care had depleted the estate. He looked me directly in the eye, standing in his dark wood study after the funeral, and told me she left us nothing but fond memories. He lied. He looked at his grieving daughter and delivered a calculated, spectacular lie to cover his own greed. I looked up at Marcus. The initial shock evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, surgical fury, the kind of fury that built empires. Pull everyone, I commanded, my voice slicing through the quiet room. I want the entire Alpha team on this right now. I want every forensic accountant, every data analyst, every white hat penetration tester in this building focused exclusively on Zenith Freight and the Eleanor Hayes Trust. We tear them apart bite by bite, completely legal, completely ruthless. I want to know where every single cent went when it moved and whose signature authorized the transfer. Marcus did not waste a second. He tapped his earpiece, barking rapid orders to my floor directors. Within 10 minutes, my pristine executive suite transformed into a high-stakes digital war room. For the next 48 hours, the polished glass walls of the 40th floor reflected a relentless cascade of data. We did not need to hack Winston's systems illegally. Winston was arrogant, and arrogant men always believe their outdated security protocols are invincible. Through publicly available financial disclosures, routine vendor audits, and exploiting the massive security vulnerabilities in Zenith Freight's antiquated servers, my team mapped out the greatest financial deception I had ever witnessed. As the pieces locked into place, the sheer audacity of the betrayal became staggering. Winston was the sole executor of the trust. According to the original legal charter we uncovered in the county probate archives, the trust was explicitly mandated to be divided equally among her grandchildren upon their 25th birthdays. That included me. That money was my rightful safety net, my foundation. Instead of distributing it, Winston bled it completely dry. He set up the dummy vendor accounts at Zenith Freight. He authorized phantom logistics contracts paying those shell companies out of Zenith's operating budget. Then he miraculously refilled Zenith's drained coffers with direct wire transfers from the trust. He was actively washing his own mother's money through his failing business to make himself look like a self-made titan of industry. Zenith Freight was a zombie company. Winston was bleeding capital because he was an incompetent CEO who refused to adapt to modern logistics, and he used my inheritance as a limitless slush fund to hide his massive professional failures from his country club friends. But the data revealed an even darker layer to the conspiracy. Winston did not act alone. Marcus flagged a series of secondary routing numbers attached to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Delaware LLCs. We traced the digital fingerprints following the IP logs and authorized user access points. They led straight back to a luxury-gated community in Buckhead, Aaliyah. My perfect golden child sister was completely complicit. Her name was buried deep in the metadata as an authorized secondary trustee. While I had been sleeping on a second-hand futon working freelance coding jobs until my vision blurred just to afford instant ramen, Aaliyah had been treating a generational trust fund like a personal black card. The data told the true story that her carefully curated social media accounts hid. Aaliyah used her stolen portion to literally buy her socialite status. We tracked the routing numbers directly to the vendors. The $250,000 destination wedding in Santorini was funded entirely by stolen trust money. The matching luxury SUVs, the exclusive country club memberships, the spontaneous trips to Paris and Milan. She used my grandmother's money to purchase her way into Atlanta's absolute highest elite circles. Worse, she used it to aggressively cover Connor's failures. When Connor cratered his first major commercial real estate deals, due to his blinding incompetence, Aaliyah panicked. To avoid the social embarrassment of a downgraded lifestyle or a public bankruptcy, she siphoned hundreds of thousands from the trust to artificially inflate Connor's investment portfolio. She saved him from professional ruin, paying off his hidden gambling debts and toxic loans, all to keep up the pristine illusion of their flawless marriage. Winston allowed it because Aaliyah was his ultimate trophy. Her proximity to high society gave him the social leverage he craved among the city's power brokers. He sacrificed his own mother's legacy and discarded his middle daughter entirely just to prop up a failing logistics company and a fake socialite. They had literally stolen my past to finance their fraudulent present. And then when that stolen well finally began to run dry, they had the unmitigated gall to steal my actual identity to open fresh lines of credit to keep the party going. I stood over the central console as the final decryption sequence finished running. The complete financial map of their ruined empire was displayed in undeniable clarity. Compile it all, I instructed my lead data engineer. I watched as the progress bar filled on the screen. I pulled a sleek military-grade titanium flash drive from my desk drawer and inserted it into the secure port. I dragged the entire meticulously documented dossier onto the drive. Every single fraudulent wire transfer, every forged signature, every ghost vendor invoice, every offshore routing number, and the high-definition audio recording of Vivian's arrogant confession in my office. It was the digital equivalent of a nuclear warhead armed and ready to detonate. I pulled the drive from the port and gripped it tightly in the palm of my hand. The cool metal felt incredibly heavy with justice. For my entire life, they had controlled the narrative. They had dictated who was successful and who was a failure. They had written the script and they had cast me as the villain. Now I owned the network, the bank, the evidence, and their entire future. Marcus stepped up beside me, his tablet already loaded with the drafted federal indictments. "We are ready to transmit this directly to the Department of Justice, Jada," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The warrants can be executed by tomorrow morning." I looked at the flash drive, a dark smile touching the corners of my mouth. "Keep the DOJ on standby." "Marcus," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy, "do not file the charges yet. I am not going to let a federal marshal deliver this news. They took everything from me in person. I am going to return the favor." I grabbed my tailored blazer from the back of my chair and slipped it on, smoothing the lapels. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," I told him, walking toward the heavy glass doors of the executive suite. "It is time for a family visit." The drive to Buckhead took exactly 22 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in absolute silence, letting the rhythmic hum of the engine focus my mind into a sharp, lethal point. The wrought iron gates of my parents' sprawling suburban estate loomed ahead, a monument to their unchecked greed. I punched in the access code they had never bothered to change and drove up the sweeping, circular driveway. The property was immaculate. Lush, manicured gardens stretched out beneath towering oak trees, framing the massive brick mansion. Every imported shrub, every brick, every drop of water in the tiered fountain was paid for by a dead woman's stolen trust. I parked my car behind Aaliyah's white Range Rover. I did not bother ringing the front doorbell. I knew their routines intimately. On a Thursday afternoon, they would be exactly where they always were, holding court, on the multi-tiered stone patio overlooking the private tennis court. I walked around the perimeter of the house, my heels striking the flagstone path with measured precision. As I rounded the corner, the scene played out exactly as I had anticipated. Winston sat at the head of a massive teak dining table, casually swirling a glass of expensive red wine. He looked relaxed, wearing a crisp linen shirt embodying the role of the untouched patriarch. Aaliyah was sprawled across a cushioned chaise lounge a few feet away, holding her phone in one hand and a mimosa in the other, draped in silk designer loungewear. Vivian sat rigidly next to Winston. The moment her eyes locked onto me, her wineglass froze halfway to her lips. She had not told him. I could see the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her rigid posture. She was hoping I was bluffing. I did not offer a greeting. I walked straight up to the teak table and slammed the thick, black-bound audit summary down onto the center of the glass surface. The heavy thud echoed sharply across the patio, causing Aaliyah to jump and spill a splash of orange juice onto her silk robe. "What is your problem, Jada?" Aaliyah snapped, scrambling to wipe the liquid off her leg. "You cannot just barge in here. Connor is upstairs packing a bag and having an absolute breakdown because of whatever psychotic stunt you pulled at his office today. You have ruined his career." I ignored her completely, keeping my eyes locked on Winston. "Your husband ruined his own career, Aaliyah," I said, my voice cold and flat. "But he is a minor casualty compared to what is sitting on this table." Winston set his wine glass down slowly. He looked at the black binder, then up at me, a condescending smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He was entirely unbothered. He still viewed me as the disappointing middle child who had abandoned a prestigious pre-law track to play with computers. "I suppose Vivian told you about the temporary bridge loan we took out," Winston said, waving his hand dismissively. "She came home quite hysterical." "You need to lower your voice, Jada. Do not mistake a simple financial maneuver for some kind of grand conspiracy. We will pay the bank back. You are making a massive issue out of standard corporate leveraging. I reached out and flipped the binder open. I am not here about the $200,000 you stole from me to fund a destination wedding. I stated my words, cutting through the humid afternoon air. I am here about the $40 million you laundered through Zenith Freight and Logistics. I am here about the ghost vendors, the offshore shell companies, and the complete systematic draining of the Eleanor Hayes Generational Trust. The patio went dead silent. Aaliyah dropped her phone. It clattered against the stone pavers, the screen cracking, but she did not even look down. Vivian covered her mouth with her hand, a strangled gasp escaping her throat. Winston's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of hardened stone. I spent the last 48 hours tearing apart Zenith's digital infrastructure. I continued leaning over the table to ensure he heard every single syllable. You created 30 fake logistics consulting firms. You paid them millions of dollars out of Zenith's operating budget to make the company look like it was taking heavy operational losses. Then you replenished Zenith's accounts by bleeding my grandmother's estate dry. You stole millions of dollars meant for your children, Winston. You washed it through your failing supply chain business, just so you could keep playing the role of a successful CEO. I turned my gaze to Aaliyah, who was now trembling visibly on the chaise lounge. And you helped him, I said. Your digital signature is all over the secondary offshore routing accounts. You funneled hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars into your personal checking. You used my grandmother's legacy to buy your country club status, your designer wardrobe, and a $250,000 wedding in Santorini. You even used it to secretly bail Connor out of toxic commercial real estate debt so your friends would not find out your perfect husband is a colossal failure. Aaliyah opened her mouth to speak, her eyes darting frantically to Winston, but no words came out. The pristine illusion of her life had just been violently stripped away. I looked back at my father. I have the entire forensic audit right here. The routing numbers, the forged authorizations, the IP access logs from this exact house. It is all packaged and ready to be transmitted directly to the Department of Justice. The FBI will seize this estate before sundown tomorrow. I waited for the panic. I waited for Winston to crumble the way Connor had to beg and negotiate the way Vivian had. I expected the patriarch to finally break under the crushing weight of undeniable evidence. Instead, Winston leaned back in his chair. A low, rumbling chuckle started deep in his chest. It grew into a full, resonant laugh. He reached out, picked up his wine glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. You really think you are something special, do you not? Jada? He said, his voice entirely devoid of fear. You crack a few passwords, print out a spreadsheet, and suddenly you think you are the master of the universe. You think you can walk onto my property and threaten me. I am not threatening you, I corrected him. I am giving you your execution notice. Winston slammed his hand down on the table, the sudden violence rattling the patio furniture. He stood up, using his imposing height to cast a shadow over the table. I am the patriarch of this family, he bellowed, the raw toxic entitlement radiating from his every pore. I built the name that gives you any relevance in this city. My mother's money belongs to me. She was an old woman who did not understand modern capital. I took what was rightfully mine to manage as I saw fit. I am the head of this estate. What is mine is mine. You think you can touch me, Jada. You think a bitter, ungrateful dropout playing corporate detective can take down a man who controls half the shipping routes in the Southeast. He laughed again, a harsh, dismissive sound. He reached down and dismissively flicked the cover of my audit summary closed. You are too late, he said, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute chilling confidence. You think you cornered me, but you are playing a game you do not even understand. Winston leaned in, bracing his heavy hands against the edge of the table. I do not care about your little printouts. I do not care about your threats regarding the Department of Justice. Because by this time next week, none of it will matter. Zenith Freight is entering into a massive exclusive merger with Omnitech. The name sent a spike of genuine shock through my system. Omnitech was a shadowy, multi-billion-dollar international conglomerate known for aggressively swallowing vulnerable supply chain networks and burying their financial histories in impenetrable corporate bureaucracy. They are buying Zenith for a sum that will make your little cybersecurity firm look like a lemonade stand. Winston sneered, his chest puffed out in total triumph. The influx of capital will instantly cover the trust deficits. The shell companies will be dissolved and absorbed into Omnitech's international ledgers. The paper trail you think you hold will simply cease to exist. It will be legally classified as proprietary merger data, entirely sealed from any federal probe. He stepped around this table, standing inches from me, radiating sheer invincibility. I am announcing the merger publicly at the Black Business Excellence Gala this Saturday. Winston proclaimed, his voice echoing across the manicured lawn. I am going to sign the final acquisition papers on stage in front of the mayor, the governor, and every major power broker in this state. I am going to secure my legacy forever. So take your little binder, Jada. Go back to your glass tower and count your pennies. You cannot touch me. You never could. I stood my ground, staring into the eyes of a man who believed his own toxic myth so deeply he thought he was a god. He thought Omnitech was his salvation. He had no idea what I was truly capable of. Enjoy the gala. Winston, I said quietly. I turned my back on the patriarch, leaving the audit on the table. The real game had just begun. You are just jealous. Aaliyah sneered, her voice trembling slightly as she desperately tried to rebuild her shattered reality. She adjusted her silk robe, lifting her chin with a practiced, haughty defiance. You can play CEO all you want, Jada. You can bring your little binders and your threats. But you will always be a loser looking in from the outside. You will never belong in our world. I did not argue. I did not even grant her the dignity of a response. Arguing with a parasite only validates its existence. I simply picked up my keys from the edge of the glass table, turned my back on the patriarch and his golden child, and walked away. Behind me, Winston let out another booming laugh, utterly convinced of his own invincibility. He believed he had won. He believed his shadowy corporate savior was going to swoop in and erase his crimes, the architecture of a trap. I walked down the sweeping flagstone path, the sound of my heels striking the stone in perfect rhythmic cadence. The manicured oak trees cast long, elegant shadows across the lawn. Every blade of grass, every imported flower, every brick of this sprawling estate was a monument to their unchecked greed. They had built a fortress of lies using my grandmother's legacy as the mortar. I reached my car. The heavy door shut with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly severing the ambient noise of the suburban estate. I pressed the ignition. The engine purred to life, a low, powerful vibration that resonated through the steering wheel and matched the steady, calculating rhythm of my pulse. I tapped the digital console interface and routed a highly encrypted secure line to Victor Sterling. Victor was the chief financial officer of Vanguard Cyber Defense, a man whose brilliance with corporate acquisitions was matched only by his absolute loyalty to my vision. He answered on the first ring. Status. Victor. I asked, my voice calm and entirely devoid of the adrenaline that had spiked on the patio. We have full confirmation, Victor replied smoothly, the sound of typing echoing faintly in the background. Zenith Freight's legal team just returned the countersigned preliminary agreements to our proxy representatives. Winston took the bait completely. He is practically salivating. He believes this buyout is his ultimate salvation. He is rushing the final due diligence phases to ensure the announcement can be made public this Saturday. He is desperate, I noted, pulling out of the circular driveway and steering the car toward the massive iron gates of the estate. A desperate man never checks his blind spots. Winston was a dinosaur. He operated in a world of handshakes, country club whispers, and superficial prestige. He did not understand the modern architecture of digital finance. When his logistics company began hemorrhaging capital to cover the trust deficit, he went looking for a corporate bailout. He found Omnitech. Omnitech presented itself as an aggressive international holding conglomerate specializing in supply chain acquisitions. It featured shell corporate offices located in Geneva and Singapore, a formidable board of directors composed entirely of digital ghosts, a perfectly clean, terrifyingly efficient corporate record. Winston believed he was selling his soul to a faceless European titan. He did not know that Omnitech was an absolute phantom. It was a proprietary acquisition vehicle created, funded, and entirely controlled by Vanguard Cyber Defense. The final move. Did his legal counsel push back on any of the acquisition clauses? I asked, watching the iron gates of my parents' neighborhood shrink in the rearview mirror. Not a single one, Victor said, a hint of dark amusement in his tone. We structured the contract to look incredibly predatory on paper, to satisfy his ego. Winston thinks he is outsmarting a ruthless conglomerate by taking their cash to cover his tracks. The contract includes a total absorption clause. Omnitech assumes all of Zenith's liabilities pending a final post-signature audit. He thinks the merger will wash his shell companies clean. He thinks he's going to sign away his crimes on a stage, I murmured, navigating the car onto the highway back toward the city. He's going to stand up in front of the mayor and the governor and hand me his entire company. The Black Business Excellence Gala was the crown jewel of Atlanta's social and corporate calendar. Winston had spent a decade cultivating his image as a titan of industry specifically for rooms exactly like that one. He planned to use the gala to announce the merger, to cement his legacy, and to publicly humiliate anyone who doubted his supremacy. He is preparing a victory speech, Victor confirmed. Our proxies have assured his team that the Omnitech Executive Board will have a representative present at the gala to finalize the signatures under the spotlight. Excellent. I gripped the steering wheel, the Atlanta skyline rising in the distance, like a glittering testament to real power. The forensic audit I had left on his patio was not a threat. It was a distraction. It was a calculated psychological maneuver to force him into rushing the Omnitech deal before he had time to realize the trap had already snapped shut around his ankle. Initiate Phase 2. I commanded, my voice cold, precise, and absolute. Draft the final merger agreements. Let my father think Omnitech is signing the deal at the gala. He has absolutely no idea who owns that conglomerate. The flashbulbs of the local paparazzi popped in rapid, blinding succession outside the grand entrance of the Atlanta Biltmore. The Black Business Excellence Gala was the absolute pinnacle of the city's corporate and social calendar, a velvet-roped sanctuary where fortunes were flaunted and legacies were cemented. Tonight it was the stage for Winston's ultimate deception. He stepped out of a rented luxury sedan, immediately puffing out his chest and buttoning his tuxedo jacket with the practiced arrogance of a king surveying a conquered territory. He played the part flawlessly, greeting business rivals and local politicians with a booming laugh and firm handshakes, projecting the illusion of a man on top of the world. Vivian was right beside him, her arm looped through his. She was draped in a suffocating amount of emerald silk, her neck and wrists glittering with diamonds. Every single stone she wore had been purchased with stolen money. They were parading my grandmother's liquidated estate in front of the cameras, acting as if they were entirely untouchable. Aaliyah followed closely behind, pausing every few steps to ensure the photographers captured the perfect angle of her designer gown. Her fake practice smile was plastered across her face, radiating the manufactured charm of a woman who had bought her socialite status with someone else's inheritance. But the facade ended with Connor. He trailed behind his wife, a stark and pathetic contrast to their manufactured perfection. Connor was sweating profusely through his rented tuxedo collar, his eyes darting nervously around the red carpet. He compulsively wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked exactly like a man who knew he was completely broke, utterly unemployed, and surviving entirely on borrowed time and stolen trust funds. He was terrified the entire house of cards was about to collapse. 10 minutes later, my own driver pulled up to the curb. I did not arrive in a rented vehicle. I stepped out of the matte black town car, and the ambient energy on the red carpet seemed to physically shift. I wore a custom-tailored backless crimson gown that moved like liquid fire against my skin. My hair was swept up in a flawless structural updo, and my posture radiated the kind of absolute untouchable power that you cannot fake with stolen money. The cameras pivoted, instantly drawn to the sudden shift in gravity. Whispers rippled through the crowd of Atlanta's elite as they tried to identify the woman commanding the space with such effortless, quiet authority. I was not the disgraced dropout middle child anymore. I was the predator walking directly into the trap I had personally built. I bypassed the press line without a glance, walking through the heavy brass doors and into the grand foyer. The room was a sea of tailored suits and expensive evening gowns, humming with the sound of a live string quartet and the clinking of champagne flutes. I accepted a glass from a passing waiter, my eyes scanning the room to locate my targets. I had not taken 10 steps before Aaliyah materialized from the crowd. She moved with aggressive purpose, flanked by 3 prominent society wives, women who traded entirely in gossip and husband-funded status. Aaliyah's eyes narrowed into slits as she took in my gown. A flash of pure venomous jealousy crossed her features before she violently suppressed it, forcing a condescending, sickly sweet smirk onto her face. She was desperate to reassert her dominance in front of her high society audience. Jada, Aaliyah announced, pitching her voice unnaturally loud to ensure the women around her heard every single syllable. What an absolute surprise. I honestly did not realize they sold tickets to this event to the general public. Did you sneak in as someone's plus one? The 3 society wives offered polite, uncomfortable titters, glancing at my crimson gown with poorly concealed envy. Aaliyah took a step closer, her eyes sweeping over me with practiced theatrical disdain. "You really should not have come here," she continued, leaning in to feign sisterly concern, while simultaneously raising her volume for the crowd. "Winston is finalizing a massive corporate merger tonight. It is the biggest deal of his career. The absolute last thing he needs is his struggling estranged daughter crashing the gala to beg his colleagues for an entry-level coding job. Please tell me you brought resumes at least. If you wait by the coat check, I might be able to introduce you to an HR manager later." I did not shrink back. I did not break eye contact. I looked at the 3 society wives, offering them a warm, brilliant, and completely unbothered smile before turning my gaze back to my sister. The sheer panic vibrating beneath her heavy makeup was palpable. She was trying to publicly humiliate me to mask her own terror. I let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds. I watched her smirk begin to waver, her confidence cracking under the weight of my absolute stillness. "I am not looking for a job, Aaliyah," I said, my voice smooth, melodic, and laced with a cold, terrifying certainty. "I am here to close a deal." Before she could process the weight of my words or formulate a response, the heavy brass doors of the main ballroom swung open. A resonant chime echoed through the foyer, signaling the beginning of the evening's main event. The crowd immediately turned and began to filter inside, eager for the keynote address. Through the sea of people, I saw Winston striding confidently toward the main stage, adjusting his tuxedo jacket as he approached the microphone. He stepped up to the podium, beaming at the audience, completely unaware that Omnitech was a phantom and that his executioner was standing in the front row. The applause was deafening as Winston tapped the microphone. He stood bathed in the golden stage lights, the very picture of a self-made titan. He gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, his chest expanding as he looked out over the sea of Atlanta's most powerful figures. "Thank you," Winston boomed, his baritone voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "Tonight is not just a celebration of business. It is a celebration of legacy. It is a testament to what we can achieve when we prioritize family integrity and absolute excellence." I stood perfectly still near the front of the crowd, a glass of sparkling water in my hand. Aaliyah and Vivian were seated at the premier VIP table, directly below the stage, gazing up at him with rapt adoration. They were entirely convinced that their nightmare was over. For 30 years, Zenith Freight has been the lifeblood of this city's logistics network. Winston continued, sweeping his arm outward in a grand gesture. But to secure our legacy for the next generation, a company must evolve. That is why tonight, I am incredibly proud to announce that Zenith Freight has agreed to a historic multi-million-dollar acquisition by Omnitech. The ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. Mayors, senators, and rival CEOs clapped politely, acknowledging the sheer scale of the deal. Winston soaked it in, letting the applause wash over him for a long, self-satisfied moment. "This merger represents the pinnacle of our family's hard work," he proclaimed, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. It secures our financial future and proves that Black-owned enterprises can command the attention of global conglomerates. The paperwork is finalized. The ink is ready. I would like to ask the Chief Executive Officer of Omnitech's parent company to step forward and join me on stage to make this historic merger official. The primary stage lights dimmed. A single brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkness sweeping across the crowded ballroom. The string quartet began to play a rising, triumphant chord. Winston held his gold-plated fountain pen smiling warmly into the dark. The spotlight swept past the VIP tables. It swept past the mayor. It swept past the rows of society wives. It stopped dead on me. The crimson silk of my gown seemed to ignite under the intense beam of light. The triumphant music abruptly faltered as the string section lost their place. A collective, breathless silence crashed down over the ballroom. 500 of the city's elite turned their heads in unison to stare at the woman illuminated in the center of the room. At the VIP table, Vivian's champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It shattered against the floor with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. Aaliyah sat frozen, her jaw literally dropping open, the color completely draining from her carefully contoured face. I handed my water glass to a stunned waiter. I lifted the hem of my gown and walked gracefully toward the stage. The crowd parted for me instantly, stepping back as if I were made of fire. I climbed the carpeted stairs with measured, deliberate steps. Winston's confident smile collapsed. His face turned the color of wet ash. As I stepped up to the podium and stood shoulder to shoulder with him, I could hear his breath hitching in his chest. His hands shook violently, the gold pen rattling against the acrylic surface of the stand. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath, his voice barely a terrified squeak. "Get off this stage." I ignored him completely. I reached out and adjusted the microphone, pulling it smoothly toward my own mouth. I looked out at the sea of shocked faces, the flashing cameras of the business press, and the frozen, terrified expressions of my mother and sister. "Good evening," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clear, absolute authority. "My name is Jada Wilson. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Cyber Defense. We are the sole parent company and total financial architects of the Omnitech conglomerate." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the ballroom. Camera flashes began to detonate in rapid, blinding bursts. Beside me, Winston swayed on his feet, grasping the podium just to keep himself upright. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. The trap had entirely closed. "Winston Wilson brought you all here tonight to celebrate a legacy." I continued, my tone dropping to a cold surgical edge. "He told you Omnitech was his salvation. He believed he was selling his failing logistics company to a faceless European entity to quietly erase his massive financial crimes. But Omnitech does not exist. It is a proprietary acquisition vehicle I built specifically to audit his entire operation." The murmurs escalated into outright gasps. Journalists in the front row were frantically typing on their phones, their recording devices thrust toward the stage. Therefore, I announced, projecting my voice over the rising chaos. "I am officially pulling out of this merger. Vanguard Cyber Defense will not acquire Zenith Freight." I reached into the small clutch purse at my waist and pulled out the military-grade titanium flash drive. It glinted under the stage lights. "We are terminating this acquisition due to undeniable evidence of gross financial mismanagement, targeted identity theft, and multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement executed by Winston's executive team," I declared. "For the past 5 years, the leadership of Zenith Freight has actively laundered millions of dollars stolen from the Eleanor Hayes Generational Trust to artificially prop up their profit margins and fund their personal lavish lifestyles." I stepped down from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage. A prominent business reporter from the Atlanta Chronicle was standing directly below me, his mouth open in shock. I dropped the heavy titanium flash drive directly into his outstretched hand. "Every forged signature, every ghost vendor invoice, and every offshore wire transfer is on that drive," I told the reporter clearly. "The decryption key is taped to the back. Publish it all." The ballroom completely exploded. The polite elite gathering dissolved into absolute chaos. Reporters shouted questions, pushing against the stage. Guests pulled out their phones, recording the unmasking of the city's most arrogant patriarch. Camera flashes turned the room into a blinding strobe light. Behind me, Winston let out a guttural sound of pure defeat. He stumbled backward, his pristine tuxedo jacket catching on the edge of the podium. Vivian was screaming from the floor, trying to push through the crowd toward the stage, while Aaliyah sat paralyzed in her chair, weeping uncontrollably, as the society wives she had tried to impress actively backed away from her. Above the roaring noise of the crowd, a new sound cut through the ballroom. The heavy brass doors at the main entrance slammed open with enough force to rattle the hinges. A line of men and women, wearing dark tactical windbreakers, with large yellow letters printed across the back, marched into the room. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agents moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, marching straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, parting the chaotic crowd like the Red Sea. They did not look at the guests. They did not look at the cameras. Their eyes were locked entirely on the man trembling on the stage. My legal team had timed the transmission of the forensic audit perfectly. The identity theft and wire fraud charges were no longer a threat. They were a federal reality. I stepped to the side, folding my hands together, and watched the authorities ascend the stairs to collect the broken remains of a fake king. The lead FBI agent did not hesitate. He bypassed the podium, grabbed my father by the shoulder of his crisp tuxedo jacket, and spun him around. Winston's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence. Winston Wilson. You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and aggravated identity theft. The agent recited, his voice completely devoid of emotion. You cannot do this. Winston finally sputtered, his voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch. Do you have any idea who I am? I demand to speak to my legal counsel. You are making a monumental mistake. The agent ignored him. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around Winston's wrists was amplified by the podium microphone, echoing across the silent, captivated ballroom. The sound was absolute and final. Two more agents stepped up, flanking my father, firmly gripping his arms. They marched him down the stage stairs, parading him directly through the center of the crowd he had just tried to command. The silence shattered. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions and blinding camera flashes. The city's elite, the very people Winston had spent 3 decades trying to impress, were now capturing his total humiliation on their smartphones. They were hungry for the scandal, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Wilson Empire, the collapse of an illusion. At the VIP table, the reality of my mother's perfect life violently imploded. Vivian gripped the edge of the glass table, her knuckles stark white, before her knees finally gave out. She slumped heavily into her gilded banquet chair, the emerald silk of her stolen gown pooling awkwardly around her. She raised her hands to her face, sobbing hysterically. She reached out blindly, grasping for the hands of the society wives she had spent hours gossiping with just moments before. Not a single woman reached back. The wives physically recoiled, stepping away from the table as if Vivian were carrying a deadly contagion. Their eyes were cold, instantly calculating the social damage of being photographed anywhere near her. Vivian was immediately and permanently exiled from the only world she cared about. She was reduced to a weeping, isolated spectacle. A few feet away, the gravity of the situation finally penetrated Connor's thick skull. He stood frozen, staring at the stage, his face pale and slick with sweat. He had married Aaliyah for the Wilson fortune. He had endured her relentless condescension and Winston's bullying because he believed the bank accounts were bottomless. He had let them secretly pay off his toxic commercial real estate debts using what he now knew was stolen trust money. Aaliyah scrambled up from her chair. She was trembling violently, her designer gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. She lunged toward Connor, her hands grasping desperately at his tuxedo lapels. "Connor, do something!" Aaliyah shrieked, her voice shrill and hysterical over the roar of the crowd. "Call our lawyers! Call somebody! You have to fix this!" Connor looked down at her hands, then up at the federal agents leading his father-in-law out the double doors. The math was actively computing in his head. Winston was going to federal prison. The accounts were frozen. The estate was going to be seized. There was absolutely no money left. Severing ties. Connor violently shoved Aaliyah's hands off his chest. He took a massive step back, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure disgust. "Fix this!" Connor bellowed, his voice carrying across the lobby. "You expect me to fix this? You told me your father was liquid. You told me the trust fund was endless. You are a fraud, Aaliyah. Your entire family is a pathetic criminal fraud." Connor, "Please." Aaliyah begged, fresh tears streaming down her contoured face. "We are your family. We can figure this out." "You are not my family." Connor spat back, his voice dripping with venom. "You are a liability. You used stolen money to pay my debts. The FBI is going to come looking for that capital. I am not going to federal prison because you and your father decided to rob your own grandmother." He turned his back on her, adjusting his collar with shaking hands. "Do not ever call me again," Connor announced loud enough for the nearby reporters to capture. "I am filing for divorce the second I wake up tomorrow morning. We are completely done." Connor stormed toward the side exit, pushing past the gawking waiters and disappearing into the night. He abandoned his wife to face the impending federal indictments entirely alone. Aaliyah stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom floor. Her shield was gone. Her money was gone. Her marriage had just dissolved in front of 500 people. She was entirely exposed. The crushing weight of the digital signatures I possessed, the signatures proving she had personally routed hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars offshore, finally crashed down on her. Her chest heaved as she struggled to draw breath. The realization that she was facing decades behind bars was written plainly in her wide, bloodshot eyes. She knew exactly what she had signed. She had traded her freedom for a destination wedding and country club dues, and the bill had just come due. I watched the scene unfold with absolute cold detachment. The surgical precision of the trap was flawless. The cancer had been entirely excised. I stepped down from the side of the stage, bypassing the frenzy of the press, and began making my way toward the grand foyer exit. My work here was done. I had almost reached the heavy brass doors when I heard the frantic, desperate clicking of heels rushing across the marble floor behind me. "Jada, wait!" A hand grabbed my arm, the grip tight and shaking. I stopped and slowly turned around. Aaliyah stood there, her flawless facade completely ruined. Her mascara was smeared, her breathing jagged and shallow. The haughty, arrogant golden child who had mocked me on the patio was entirely gone. In her place was a terrified woman staring directly into the abyss. "Jada, please." Aaliyah gasped, her fingers digging into the fabric of my sleeve like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. I looked down at her hand. I did not shake it off. I simply stared at it until the sheer freezing weight of my gaze forced her to loosen her grip and let her arm drop to her side. "You have to help me," she stammered, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a frantic, unstructured rush. Connor left me. He took the car. He canceled my cards. The federal agents inside are locking down the building and seizing the corporate accounts. My personal accounts are tied to the trust routing numbers. They are going to freeze everything, Jada. I will not even have money for a taxi, let alone a criminal defense attorney. She took a shuddering breath, her eyes darting wildly around the valet area, terrified that the paparazzi might turn their lenses away from our father's arrest and focus on her collapse. "You have to wire me a retainer," Aaliyah begged, her voice dropping into a desperate, pathetic whisper. "Just enough to get a top-tier lawyer. You clearly have the capital. You own this entire conglomerate. We are sisters, Jada. We share the same blood. You cannot let them put me in federal prison." I stood motionless under the warm, ambient glow of the hotel's exterior lighting. I analyzed the woman standing in front of me. For 30 years, she had been the favored daughter, the pristine reflection of my parents' toxic vanity. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate her own status. She had willingly and knowingly signed the documents to drain our grandmother's estate, using stolen legacy funds to finance her designer wardrobe and her lavish Greek wedding. She had never shown an ounce of remorse, not until the exact moment the consequences finally arrived at her doorstep. I waited for the familiar spike of anger. I waited for the resentment that had burned in my chest for decades to flare up and consume me. It never came. There was no anger left. There was no bitterness. Looking at Aaliyah in her ruined designer gown begging for salvation on the concrete curb, I felt nothing but a profound glacial indifference. She was no longer a threat. She was no longer a rival. She was simply a parasite that had finally been severed from its host. Aaliyah saw the absolute emptiness in my eyes, and it broke her completely. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the pavement, the expensive silk of her dress pooling in the dirty valet lane. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, sobbing openly, abandoning every shred of the dignity she had spent her life cultivating. "Please, Jada," she wept, staring up at me from the ground. "I have absolutely nothing." I looked down at her, my expression perfectly still. "I wish I could help you, Aaliyah," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and devastatingly calm. "But I am just an ugly college dropout. Failures do not have that kind of money." I did not wait for her response. I turned away, the fabric of my crimson gown sweeping silently across the concrete, and stepped into the waiting back seat of my town car. The heavy door shut with a solid, definitive thud, instantly cutting off the sound of her sobbing. I tapped the privacy glass partition, and the driver immediately pulled away from the curb, leaving my sister weeping on the ground as the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the night behind us. 6 months later, the absolute destruction of the Wilson Empire was complete. The forensic audit I had handed over to the press, and the federal authorities acted as a terminal diagnosis. Winston's house of cards collapsed with terrifying speed. Without the stolen trust funds to artificially inflate Zenith Freight's operating margins, the company imploded under the weight of its own toxic debt. Winston and Vivian were indicted on 34 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and corporate embezzlement. Their downfall was spectacular and public. Winston, the arrogant patriarch who believed he was an untouchable king, crumbled during the trial. He was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary in Florida, stripped entirely of his tailored suits and his manufactured authority. Vivian's complicity in laundering the trust funds earned her a 7-year sentence. Her social standing evaporated the moment the handcuffs clicked. The sprawling manicured estate in Buckhead, the monument to their vanity, was foreclosed on and seized by the bank. It was auctioned off to a commercial real estate developer who immediately gutted the property to build townhomes. Aaliyah managed to avoid a severe prison sentence by cooperating aggressively with federal prosecutors, turning over every piece of internal documentation she had to save herself. However, she could not escape the financial ruin. Connor filed for a highly publicized, ruthless divorce. He used a team of aggressive corporate lawyers to legally saddle her with the entirety of their shared marital debt, successfully arguing that her hidden financial crimes invalidated their prenuptial agreements. The golden child, who had never worked a day in her life, was now working a minimum wage retail job at a fast fashion boutique in a strip mall outside the city limits. She spent her days folding synthetic sweaters and organizing clearance racks, funneling every paycheck into a court-ordered restitution fund, completely exiled from the luxury she believed was her birthright. The lighting inside the private dining room of Atlanta's most exclusive Michelin star restaurant was warm and golden, a stark contrast to the cold, harsh realities of the past 6 months. I sat at the head of a long, polished oak table, wearing a perfectly tailored ivory suit. I was not surrounded by blood relatives. I was not surrounded by people who demanded conditional obedience or transactional love. I was surrounded by my chosen family. Victor Sterling sat to my right, laughing deeply at a joke made by our lead cybersecurity architect. To my left sat the mentors who had guided me when I had nothing, the brilliant, dedicated colleagues who had helped me build Vanguard Cyber Defense, from a tiny, struggling startup into an international powerhouse. These were the people who had recognized my potential when my own parents had discarded me. They had offered loyalty, brilliance, and unwavering support without ever asking me to shrink myself to make them comfortable. The waiters moved seamlessly around the room, pouring a rare vintage champagne into our crystal flutes. The ambient noise of the room was filled with genuine warmth, sharp intellect, and the kind of authentic joy that cannot be manufactured or bought with stolen money. I picked up my champagne flute and tapped a silver spoon gently against the crystal rim. The table quieted immediately, all eyes turning toward me, with genuine respect and affection. I did not raise my glass to family legacy. I did not toast to social standing or to the destruction of my enemies. I would like to propose a toast, I said, looking around the table at the faces of the people I trusted completely. To the upcoming expansion of Vanguard cyber defense into the European sector. To the brilliant minds in this room who made it possible. But more importantly, to resilience. To the understanding that true power does not come from the name you inherit, but from the foundation you build yourself. To absolute independence. Hear, hear! Victor said, raising his glass high, the rest of the table echoing the sentiment with bright, genuine smiles. I took a sip of the champagne. It was crisp, cold, and flawless. The toxic weight I had carried for 30 years was entirely gone. In its place was an absolute, unshakable peace. The game was over. The parasites were gone. I had reclaimed my grandmother's legacy, protected my future, and executed a perfect, sweet, and highly calculated justice. The morning after the dinner, I stood on the top floor of the high-rise building that formerly housed Zenith Freight's executive operations. The massive mahogany desk that Winston had used to issue his commands and count his stolen money was already gone, hauled away by liquidators. In its place stood a sleek, minimalist glass table. The oversized oil painting of my father that used to dominate the back wall had been unceremoniously taken down, leaving a blank, clean space ready for something new. The transition was moving at a blinding speed. Vanguard Cyber Defense had legally absorbed the viable assets of the logistics network, completely restructuring the supply chain to serve our international cybersecurity contracts. I watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the old Zenith Freight signage was carefully detached from the building's exterior. It was a quiet, highly efficient erasure of a toxic legacy. Victor walked into the office holding a sleek digital tablet. He did not knock because in my company there were no unnecessary formalities or ego-driven protocols. There was only efficiency, transparency, and mutual respect. The final liquidation of the Buckhead estate is processing this afternoon. Victor reported, his voice steady and professional. The funds recovered from the auction will be deposited directly back into the Eleanor Hayes Generational Trust by the end of the business day. The federal prosecutors have also confirmed that they do not need any further testimony from you. Winston's legal team is pushing for a plea deal to avoid a public trial. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the Atlanta skyline. Let them plea. The public spectacle is over. We have work to do. Victor smiled slightly, tapped his tablet, and left the room to manage the transition team. I walked over to the glass table and set down a small, silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of my grandmother, Eleanor. She was smiling, looking vibrant, and full of the fierce, unyielding intelligence that Winston had always tried to diminish. She had built her wealth through grueling hard work and sharp intuition, only to have it plundered by a son who believed he was entitled to the world simply because he existed. I traced the edge of the silver frame. I had not just recovered her stolen money, I had resurrected her spirit. The trust was fully restored, but instead of letting it sit stagnant, I was using the capital to launch a new initiative under Vanguard Cyber Defense. The Eleanor Hayes Foundation would provide full-ride scholarships and venture capital grants to young, overlooked women in the technology sector. It was designed specifically for the girls who were told they were not enough, the ones who were called failures, the ones who were forced to build their own doors because the world refused to open any for them. I looked out at the city spread below me. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air in the office felt incredibly light. For the first time in my entire life, I was not bracing for an insult. I was not anticipating a betrayal. I was not carrying the suffocating weight of my family's manufactured expectations. I was standing in an empire built entirely by my own hands, funded by my own brilliance, and protected by my own absolute independence. The past was officially buried. The future belonged exclusively to me. The ultimate moral of this story is that true security and self-worth can never be granted by toxic people, even if they share your blood. When you are surrounded by individuals who demand you shrink yourself to feed their egos, the most powerful response is not to argue, but to walk away and build your own empire in silence. Real independence is the greatest shield against manipulation. Furthermore, chosen family, those who respect, uplift, and support you unconditionally, will always be infinitely more valuable than a biological family that only views you as an asset to exploit or a scapegoat to humiliate.